That's a great call by Silas. Otherwise, our friends would not be watching anything this weekend. That's all right. They just missed the quick intro. No, the crux of it is that when we put this tasting together, the genesis for this tasting was obviously Napa and Bordeaux, and there's so many different ways to slice it. The most challenging thing, of course, is getting a lineup together, a cohesive lineup together that is, number one, just getting 6 awesome wines in quantities to be able to sustain, where we can have a good turnout, as opposed to, because so many of, these great wines are tough to get our hands on in numbers. So to be able to pull these, curate these 6 wines together for everybody to share is pretty awesome. But we're stoked about the theme that we've got too. 2016 and 2018, 2 fantastic vintages, different vintages, but both, awesome classic vintages that should be drinking well for multiple decades to come. So obviously we're tasting these on the younger side, but the nice thing is, whereas 2016 in both Bordeaux and Napa are classically styled, built for the long haul vintages, 18 is the same way, but generally speaking, the wines are a little bit more generous from both appellations. And there's some surprising accessibility on both of them. So, whereas Napa, you can typically, always kind of check in. You can really never go wrong with the Napa wines, checking in a little bit early to kind of see where they're at, because they'll give you something in their youth. Bordeaux obviously can be a little bit different, sometimes a little bit more challenging, but we think that the wines that we've selected and along with the vintages that we've included, that we have a chance to really get a glimpse at some awesome wines that, again, are still in their infancy, but are going to be awesome for years to come. From Bordeaux, we have 3 classified left bank second growths, which is awesome. From the Napa side of things, 3, I wouldn't say old school, because Schrader isn't necessarily old school, but we have 3 properties with history. Achendo from the Arajo family has been around since the 90s. Schrader since the latter part of the 90s, and then of course Dominus traces back even before that. So we have wines with serious pedigree, obviously serious scores, but 3 just awesome wines that are worthy opponents, so to speak, to our wines from Bordeaux. So with that said, we will get the night started with the 2016 Leoville Barton, and I will turn it over to my colleague Simon Lambert.
Thank you, Gerard. Welcome everyone, and good to see some of you. Some of you got blank screens, but I know you're there, so good to connect with you all. And for those of you who haven't put my face to my voice before, now's your chance. The voice is pretty distinctive. You can always identify me if you pick up the phone and can't remember my name. Just ask for the Brit. I'm here. And being a Brit, Bordeaux is close to my heart. So when we drew up this lineup, I put my hand up and said, well, can I do at least 2 of the 3 Bordeaux and leave some for my friends and colleagues here? So we're going to start with the Leoville Barton. And for those of you who've been to Bordeaux, forgive me if I just run through a few things first, but I think I love trying to give you a visual description where I can, and we've got some maps that may help along the way as well. Silas, I don't know, I sent you through just a few minutes ago a whole Bordeaux map. If you can pull that up for me, if it's available. So I think some people don't realize that visiting the city of Bordeaux, the vineyards are not, with few exceptions, are not on the doorstep. That's not true, obviously, if you go to a Brion or a Mission or something like that. So a rather fuzzy map of Bordeaux, and you can see in the center is the gray area that is the city itself. And then up to the north where the yellow patches are, that's the Medoc. And that's where we will be this evening, as far as Bordeaux is concerned. So there's a road that runs from Bordeaux up through the Medoc. It has the number D2, and it takes you past all of the major chateaux that you will see or ever come across in your life. And it's a wonderful drive, because in doing so, you see the real things, not the pictures on the label. And you can say, oh, wow, there's Chateau so-and-so and Chateau so-and-so. And so taking the D2 from Bordeaux up through the first part of the vineyard area of the Medoc, you go through Macau to Margaux, and then there's a bit of a break going through an area that's marked off there as La Marque, which is not one of the major areas. And then just north of there in box 95, starting basically with Bechevel, is Saint-Julien, the region of Saint-Julien-Bechevel. And that's where we will be, at least for this first wine this evening. So 25 miles north of the city of Bordeaux, and you'll arrive at Saint-Julien. We have here a map of the vineyard areas of Saint-Julien. And if you see from the bottom of the map, you can see Ducru-Beaucaillou and the or Bechevel, and then off to the right, and move my guys across. There we go. And the D2, which is not marked on there clearly, but you can see number 9 or number 8, Brano de Cru, and then past Bechevel. And then following that road up on the right is Ducru-Beaucaillou, but the main road takes you to number 7. And number 7 is Langoa-Barton. And I'll get to that in a moment, because across the road is Leeuward-Barton. If you look at the vineyard maps, which are quite clear, you can see that Langoa's vineyards are in sort of grey colour, and Leeuward-Barton's are in that amber orange colour. And what is interesting, just looking at this now, is that unlike many properties that we may think of, these vineyards are not contiguous. They're not all necessarily surrounding the chateau itself. And there's a very good historical reason for that, which I will now get into. So the Barton family, they arrived in Bordeaux in 1772, a little bit before Napa was making wines. And it was at that year that 27-year-old Thomas Barton left his home in Ireland and traveled to France initially, looking for opportunities. He wasn't in the wine business then, arrived in Bordeaux in 1725 and started a wine merchant or negociant business, which to this day still thrives under a slightly different name, because he partnered in 1745, he partnered with another a Frenchman called Guettier. And today that company is still running under the name of Barton and Guettier, although the Barton family are no longer associated with it. In 1821, following the French Revolution, when many of the properties were confiscated, the Barton family, Hugh Barton by then, was able to acquire their first property in Bordeaux, first chateau in Bordeaux, a property called Pontet-Langlois, which after the sale, they renamed to Langoa and then added the family name Barton. So Langoa-Barton was the first of the properties that the family acquired in Saint-Julien. Then in 1826, the vast property of what was just Léoville. So again, if you look at the map and you see the yellow of Léoville-Lascasse, you see the gray of Léoville-Poiferré, and the pinky orange of Léoville-Barton, that was at one time all one property. And through deaths, divorces, family feuds, etc., the three properties were split up. And in 1826, when they had the opportunity, Hugh Barton then purchased part of what was then just the Léoville estate, and now then became Léoville-Barton. In doing so, again, they renamed it to Léoville-Barton. But unlike most properties in Bordeaux, Léoville-Barton doesn't have its own chateau. Silas, if you could just jump to the photo of the chateau. The building that we see is, or we'll see in a sec, is that of Langoa-Barton, because as I said, Léoville-Barton doesn't have its own chateau, but because they're obviously very close to each other, all of the wines from Léoville-Barton are vinified in the cellars at Langoa-Barton, and that's the actual property. If you can't find it, Silas, don't worry too much. So a little bit of trivia for you. I didn't bring the empty bottle with me, but the chateau that you see on the label of Léoville-Barton is in fact Langoa-Barton. Confusing perhaps, but it's fun to know. And the label design was introduced in the late 1980s after a group of British artists were commissioned to create a collection of etchings depicting various Bordeaux properties. And the British artist Terence Millington's rendition of Langauer Barton was so liked by the Barton family that they said, okay, that's going to be the image on our label from now on. So moving back a little bit in time, 1924, Ronald Barton was then the owner of Léoville and Langauer, and unfortunately, because of the Second World War, had to leave France and go back to Ireland for a while, came back in 1945 and found the property to be in somewhat disrepair. Obviously, you know, men were not available to be looking after the vineyards back then, and so he then, when he returned in 45, put his heart and soul into renovating the property and bringing it back to a working vineyard again. He did that until he passed away, and there we go. So there's the chateau itself, and if you look, the absolute classic Bordeaux chateau, the Chartreuse style with the two main wings and then the centerpiece. And if you look under the balcony in the centerpiece, you can just see there the old cellar doors. Now, underneath the family room and the dining room is there, and then underneath are the old cellars. They don't use those anymore. They've built on since then, but that's it. It's a beautiful building. Ronald passed away in 83, and then his nephew, Anthony, took over. And Anthony Barton is the person that I'm sure all of us associate most with Léoville and Langauer Barton. In fact, he often visited Chicago to attend our then annual Fête de Bordeaux dinners, presenting both Léoville and Langauer. And it was always a pleasure to have him here because he's was such a raconteur and a warm personality. And in 1986, after Ronald's passing, obviously, he and his wife, Anthony and his wife, Eva, actually moved in to the chateau. And they're one of the few chateau owners that actually live, as they say in England, live above the shop. In taking over, he built the property and particularly Léoville Barton into the amazing wine that we know of today, and critical praise all around. And in fact, in 2007, he won the Decanter Magazine Man of the Year Award. Sadly, however, Anthony passed away at the age of 91 in February of this year. But in doing so, his daughter, Lillian Barton Sartoris being her married name, who had been running the property with Anthony, took over the management. And if we pop up a quick picture of Anthony and Lillian, and then after that we'll show the children. So Lillian now runs the properties, and in fact they also have their own negociant company now, Anthony Barton, or I think Anthony Barton Fine Wines, I think it is, but anyway, that's beside the point this evening. So Lillian runs the estate, or the estates, plural, and is now working with her two children, Melanie and Damien, who will in time obviously take over as well. So that's a little bit of background. If we find those photos, we can show them to you. Let's, enough talking for a moment, let's taste the wine. And then I'll come back and tell you a bit more about the wine itself. So it's a lovely deep color to the wine. Still seemingly quite young on the nose. There's cigar box and cedar wood. One of the hallmarks of really great Bordeaux is obviously the tannins, the fruit. Oh, that's a different one, but that's fine. That'll work. So it's Lillian on the left, Melanie in the center, and Damien on the right, obviously just coming from breakfast. And so they're the team that now runs the property. 125 acres for Léoville Barton, planted 74% Cabernet Sauvignon, 23% Merlot, and 3% Cabernet Franc. And they're beginning to phase out Merlot, they're beginning to phase out the Cabernet Franc, all 3% of it, in favor of adding more Merlot. Mostly gravel soil with a subsoil of clay. And if you look again on the right of the picture, next to number 3, the vineyards in there we go, those orangey vineyards there, those are sloping down towards the river, then you've got the road, and then more vineyards scattered behind the chateau to the north of the chateau and to the southwest of the chateau. As I said, 125 acres, mostly gravel with a subsoil of clay, with an average age of about 30 years on the vines, although there are some Merlots that are considerably older than that, probably 50 or even 60 years old. You can see it's divided mainly into 3 sections, with the most important part being where the name Les Barton is printed on that map there. As I said, vinification takes place in Langoa. They have very old 200 hectoliter wooden vats there, and they're in the process now of redoing all of the barrel cellars and the maturing and the fermentation cellars, and will introduce more modern technology, even though they make a great wine without it. It's aged about 50% new oak most years, and 20 months before being bottled. They release about 20,000 cases a year. And I think one of the great things about Les Barton is not just the quality, but the fact that the Bartons have, throughout the years, always tried to maintain a very fair pricing structure, a structure that being a top second growth, they could probably ask a great deal more. But Anthony Barton once said years ago, I really don't need a new car after every vintage. That's the sort of sense of humor he had, which is wonderful. For 16, which we have in our glass, 86% Cabernet Sauvignon, 13% Merlot, so no Cabernet Franc, and 60% new oak, so a touch more of new oak in this particular vintage.
Simon, if I could jump in real quick, we had a couple questions from Chris and Don about the Cabernet Franc, and I apologize for maybe I misheard. And they had mentioned that phasing out the Cab Franc. Are they phasing out the Cab Franc, or are they replanting the Cab Franc?
No, they actually will probably phase it out completely. And in fact, in 16, as you can see, because I just mentioned, there is no Cab Franc in 16.
Yeah.
And I think, if I'm correct, in fact, I do know. Yeah, 2012 was the last vintage that they used Cabernet Franc.
You want to take a stab as to why that might be?
I don't know, other than I think they like the softness and the roundness and the Merlot gives them. And I think maybe, with slightly warmer climates these days, you probably don't need Cabernet Franc the same way that in this part of Bordeaux, at least, it doesn't do as much for the wine as elsewhere. Yeah. Was there another question? Or?
No, both okay. So far just kind of similar questions about the Cabernet Franc.
Okay, so the 16 vintage is widely considered to be an excellent vintage in Bordeaux. Wines with body and dark, juicy fruit and freshness. And I think juicy is a good term to use when tasting this wine. And even though we're talking about 60% new oak, you can taste a little bit of oak on there, but this wine is still in a very young stage. The freshness, the acidity is very apparent right now, and all of that will ameliorate and soften and round out over the years, but it's probably going to be another 10 years or so before it's going to start showing really, really well. The harvest itself, there was rainfall in January and February, which was above average. A cool March delayed the bud break, and the weather remained cool until early July. And then almost perfect weather during the rest of July, August, and September allowed the grapes to mature perfectly. In fact, in the summer, there was 30% more sunshine through those 3 months of July, August, and September, 30% more sunshine that year than average in summer sunshine in Bordeaux. Ideal harvest conditions, picking late September, excuse me, through to early mid-October. In fact, the dates are, they pick that Merlot from the 29th of September to the 1st of October, and then the 5th of October to the 13th for Cabernet. I think it's a really interesting wine for us to start the evening off with, because I don't expect it to be the star of the evening from the point of view of a big blockbuster impressive wine, but there's so much subtlety, so much finesse, so much elegance going on here, that it is the epitome of the stylish wines that one gets in Saint-Julien.
I think it speaks, to that point, back in 2021 when we had our Napa Valley tasting, and almost like how the Heights Martha's Vineyard is, in that it's it's always going to be a wine that is recognized as a absolutely beautiful Cabernet, but it's never one of those wines that when you line it up against 5 or 6 other wines that is a showstopper and ultra impressive. Not that it's not an impressive wine, but it just doesn't make a statement the way that some other wines probably will tonight. Both from Bordeaux and from Napa, but it doesn't take anything away from, to your point. I mean, it's just a beautifully polished. It's quintessential Bordeaux. I mean, just to kind of start the night with, exactly what you said. I mean, just a wine that just is, just typifies exactly what Left Bank Bordeaux is. I mean, just that. To me, it was very obvious. I mean, it's just cedar smoke. The wine is it's just laser focused and super serious, but at the same time, it does have a level of accessibility and generosity that is making it enjoyable to drink now. To your point, it's obviously going to get much, much better, but this isn't such a brick house now that we can't enjoy it in this kind of setting and at least kind of see, hey, this is, and again, this is the Léoville Barton style, it's just so consistent.
Yeah, very, very, very consistent. And one should add that it was, I think, Wine Spectator chose it as their wine of the year a few years back now. And there's a reason, again, it's not going to necessarily win blind tastings, but it is, as Gerard just said, the epitome of really well-balanced, tasty Bordeaux that will age 10, 15, 20 years, probably even longer if you have the cellar and the patience. Yeah. And of course, even better with food.
Yeah, I know the wines have been, certainly terrific in the last, decade plus. Do they, have they been, and I consider them to be consistent in the modern era, so to speak, same way, going back into the 90s and early part of the 2000s as well, or do they have a little bit of not a rough stretch, but have they just, what kind of trajectory they follow?
I mean, they've always appealed. There's never been a period, as with many chateaus, that they've gone really into the doldrums. They did have a slightly quieter patch towards the end of Ronald's stay at Barton, when he was getting older and not paying as much attention to what was going on as he could do. So when Anthony arrived, that's when it really picked up again. But go back and look at some older vintages of Barton from the 20s, the 50s, the 60s, and there are some super wines there, if you can find them. Good luck. I don't have any. I drank them all.
Silas, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with you guys. I think just the subtlety, but also just the quality of the tannins is really remarkable to me. Really smooth and really long. I mean, it's a wine that just I would drink now, which I can't say for a lot of 2016 Bordeaux, which a great year, but I would sit on a lot of these wines, including the Cause that we're going to try later. I would prefer to give those more time. They're not totally unapproachable with a good decant, but this is a wine that it's just delicious.
Yeah.
I will just point out, even though we're not going to Pauillac this evening, but look at the map that we've got in front of us. And at the very top of the right side, the Label Lascasse vineyard, and then there's that dotted line that runs left to right. and you can see the arrows there saying Pauillac Saint-Julien. That's basically no more than a tiny little stream, the slight dip in the land that as you drive the D2, you go past Label Lascaux, down the dip, up the other side, and bang, there's Poifer, there's Latour, there's Pichon-Lalonde and Pichon-Baron. It's remarkable to taste, and if you taste those wines of that southern part of Pauillac, they're much more Saint-Julien-like than the wines from the northern part, even though the Latour, obviously a big, massive structured wine, and the Pichons, but they are very much softer, more Saint-Julien in style than the wines from the northern Pauillac. Anyway, just that little point there. If you blinked, you'd miss the change.
Segue into the Accendo.
Yeah. Any other questions on Barton? I can
by all means, yeah.
Yeah, but happy to answer them later.
Yeah, we'll monitor throughout, and you can always circle back, and towards the end, we'll talk about everything as a collective. So.
So I think Accendo, that's yours, isn't it, Gerard?
It is.
Yes.
So same way that you were, planting the flag for 2 Bordeaux's, I said, give me 2 Napas. Napa's right in my wheelhouse, and I love everything, and certainly love my Bordeaux, but Napa has a soft spot, always has a soft spot for me, and I'm excited to taste this. This Accendo is really, really neat because, like I said in the intro, yes, it's at the same time one of the hottest new boutique wineries in Napa Valley, but also has a ton of history behind it. So the property or the brand itself, Accendo, has only existed since 2013, but the Bart and Daphne Arajo date back to the early 90s, and were behind some of the truly one of the original cult lines of Napa Valley with the Arajo Islay Vineyard. So again, founded in 2013, and for a quarter century they'd owned that historic Islay Vineyard in Calistoga before what was fair to say an unexpected, very unexpected sale to Francois Pinault and the Artemis Group. Francois Pinault, the owner of Chateau Latour. So obviously a huge sale in 2013. They felt that they felt that they certainly were placing the Islay Vineyard in good hands, and then the vineyard has since been renamed from the Arajo estate to simply Islay Vineyard. And without question, Islay Vineyard is making some utterly spectacular wines as well. But since 2013, Bart and Daphne have been behind the Accendo cellars and are really, really doing some great things. And this is a chance to try a great Accendo from a great vintage. And Bart and Daphne came to, like I had mentioned, Napa Valley in they started producing wine in the early 90s, but in the late 80s, Bart had made his money in construction and home building, and they were both avid wine aficionados, he and his wife, and also the beneficiaries, as it always is. It's always about who you know and just kind of timing and serendipity. They formed a good relationship with Gene Phillips, who was working in real estate and very high up in real estate, and incidentally the original founder of Screaming Eagle. So it helps to know good people. And when she was in real estate, she tipped off the Arajos to an unexpected listing in Calistoga because the historic Islay Vineyard had come available after Joseph Phelps passed on the opportunity to purchase the vineyard outright. When you go back to the pre-2000 era in Napa Valley, Islay had some utterly fantastic wines being made from it, but it was never by a single producer. It was always by multiple producers, and there's a lot of great Joseph Phelps Islay vineyards that are still drinking beautifully to this day. And interestingly enough, not surprisingly, later in his life, Joseph Phelps went on record as saying that his decision not to buy Islay was one of his life's biggest regrets. So the Arajos ended up becoming stewards of this incredible property that was planted in 1884. And their Cabernet from Islay, the Arajo Islay Vineyard Cabernet, was considered one of the original cult wines of Napa and one of the most sought after vintages still now. I mean, even when we, get some of those Arajo wines into our inventory, I mean, they're here and they're gone. They're just utterly, spectacular wines. They age well. They're, to me, a beautiful balance. The winemaking by the family has always been perfectly California. I wouldn't say it leans Bordeaux or leans Napa. I just say it's a beautiful, beautiful Cabernet, and that's the same way it's always been, and it's that way with Ochendo now. So the early vintages of Arajo, when they had their estate at the Islay Vineyard, made by Tony Soder, before he handed the reins off to Francois Pechon, who still makes the wines for Ochendo in the present day. And we'll come back to that theme. That's kind of what has allowed Ochendo to really take off so quickly, is not only now do they have great vineyard sources and access to incredible fruit, but just the consistency. So they've had Francois Pechon as part of the team since 1993, going back to her time at Arajo in the Islay Vineyard, but now at Ochendo. And then in the latter stages before the sale to the Chateau Latour team, by the recommendation of Francois, they brought on Nigel Kinsman, who is certainly one of the hottest winemakers in Napa Valley now, doing his own thing with Kinsman Eads and some other awesome boutique wines. But so now Nigel Kinsman handles the red wines at Ochendo, and Francois handles the Sauvignon Blanc at Ochendo, another really, really nice, elegant wine, very classically styled as well. They also have famed Bordeaux enologist Michel Roland as part of the team. He consults on the final blend each year, and all of their vineyards are farmed by Steve Mathiasen, who's one of the most respected viticulturalists in Napa, perhaps rivaled only by David Abreu. So what makes the Ochendo so different from the Arajo Islay? The elephant in the room is that the Islay Vineyard, when Arajo made the Islay Vineyard, it was literally coming off the estate. It was a single vineyard wine. And that's it. It was not sourced from anywhere else. Obviously, with the Ochendo now, that is not the case. The wine is coming from uber premium parcels from across the valley, but it is a blend of fruit. But this is because over the course of the years, Bart and Daphne, have tasted many wines from Napa from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they'd always felt that there was something to be said. Even though at the time they were making that single vineyard wine, they felt like a lot of those BVs and those old Heights bottles and the Beringers and some from some of the Napa pioneers that were blending from across the valley to kind of give you that representative, hey, this is the best that Napa Valley can produce in a given year, as opposed to a single vineyard or a single block, which is decidedly different. And I'm not getting too far. I don't want to get too far ahead, but it's decidedly different. When we finish up with a Schrader, it could not be a more divergent philosophy, and that there's not one right way to do it or wrong way to do it. But these are the kind of settings when we can kind of taste wines that are just the Ochendo blended from premium sites from across the valley, and then down the line when we taste the Schrader, it is about as site specific a wine as you could have anywhere in the world. And they again just were always the Arajo family is always intrigued by these throwback wines that are still drinking well to this day. If anybody has some of those old BVs or Beringers or Heights wines, it's remarkable how well and how well the wines age and how classically styled they are. And then so again, thanks to some long-standing relationships in Napa and the ability to source wine from some awesome vineyards. Silas, if you want to throw that up there, how Ochendo kind of breaks out their sourcing, their vineyard map there. So the majority of their vineyards are going to be in the Oakville and Yountville area, in the heart of the valley. So the prime portion of the Ochendo is coming from Vine Hill Ranch, on the west side of Oakville there, right off of 29. Vine Hill Ranch, just a legendary vineyard, awesome stuff. The sites are home to where the Bonvicina comes from. Tor is doing some awesome stuff with Vine Hill Ranch. Vine Hill Ranch doing their own VHR. This is just a awesome property that is doing some serious things, and Ochendo is fortunate enough to have some great blocks from the Phillips family that they use. A little bit further south, they've got the Embar, a little portion of Embar Ranch. Mondavi used to make some Embar Ranch Cabernet. The Sleeping Lady Vineyard in Yountville, a little more southerly. So anytime you get any fruit from Yountville, you're getting a lot closer to San Pablo Bay there and to the southern portion of the valley. So the wines are going to be, or the Cabernet in general, just the fruit in general, not going to be as ripe and concentrated. It adds a lot more structure. It's super unique, and it really adds to the overall cohesiveness of the blend. And then you get up to, you go north, so the Ecatone Vineyard that you kind of see in the center of the screen at the top, Ecatone Vineyard, which has recently been renamed. That was at one time David Abreu's Thorvilos Vineyard, and after he lost or the no longer has that property under his name, the Bettinelli family now owns it, and it's the Ecatone Vineyard. Some incredible wines, single vineyard wines coming from there. They use a portion of the Ecatone Vineyard in the Secendo Cabernet. And then in the top left of the screen there, the Diamond Mountain. So a little portion comes from what was the old Reverie estate on Diamond Mountain. So you're getting some fruit off of the valley floor. You're getting some, high elevation fruit off of Diamond Mountain. The Ecatone Vineyard, the former Thorvilos, is, hillside vineyard that's kind of halfway up. So again, you're just getting a lot of different Cabernet Sauvignon, along with some other Bordeaux varietals. This is not 100% Cabernet, into a blend that, crushed it in 16 is only getting better. So let's get into this one and taste it. Yeah, so I did see there was a question, and I wish that the tech sheet had the ABV, and I wish I would have been smart enough to pull that before, because I don't think it's necessarily somebody had asked what the alcohol by volume was on this wine.
It's listed as 14.5.
Okay, and that's where that's where, yeah. So okay, is it on there? You just knew that, or is it on there? I'm sorry about that. Yeah, cool.
I noticed it.
Oh, cool. So yeah, in any event, like that's where I don't necessarily associate Arajo or Acendo now with with their new project to necessarily be trying to make lower alcohol wines, and the wines are certainly getting plenty ripe. I mean, 14.5 isn't by any means low alcohol, nor is it high alcohol the way that sometimes the Napa Valley wines can get from the warmer spots. But the one thing I will say, and this is just consistent with just the family's winemaking style forever, the wine is just really light on its feet. I mean, it's a 14.5 alcohol wine. It's beautiful. I mean, it's red fruited, has a little dustiness, typically that I would normally get from some wines that are, more 100% from Rutherford, or have a, significant Rutherford influence. That's not the case here. But I just think this is a really, really, it's a good wine. Silas, I know when you were pouring out the samples, this was one that, impressed you and got you excited, and kind of get your thoughts here. Grab your thoughts here. What do you think?
I right off the bat, it was, I think, the most aromatic wine right out of the bottle, and I think it's showing just as well now. It's just poised, really fine tannins, great sculpted fruit. I really like the delineation, which I think is a marker of a great wine. We can kind of parse out the different stages of the wine as well as the different elements. Yeah. I think it's pretty delicious.
No, absolutely. And I think, like I said, I just think it's so consistent that with the way the winemaking style has always been. Now, granted, again, Nigel has taken over the red wine portion, but this tastes like the Rajo wines have always tasted, the family wine, and it's a new brand, but in the philosophy is different in terms of where the grapes are coming from. But again, just the overall winemaking is not heavy-handed whatsoever. The wine's polished, and you could throw this in. I mean, I wouldn't call this a dead ringer for Bordeaux by any stretch. I just think it's just a really beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon.
I think there's a ripeness and almost a sweetness in the fruit that I was going to say sets it apart from Bordeaux for me. Yeah. I think it's a lovely wine. I think it's really well balanced and really very very appealing now. It's sexy compared to Level Button, which is a bit more cerebral right now.
Sure.
You've got to think about it a bit harder. I grabbed the empty bottle, by the way. On the back, it says 14.8.
Okay. Well, it carries it well. I mean, for a wine that's approaching 18%. To your point, I mean, it certainly has there's a richness or a hint of almost like deliciousness, sweetness, if you will. But again, I mean, I wouldn't call this wine heavy by any stretch. I mean, for a wine that's approaching 15% alcohol, I think it's done quite well. Silas, if you want to throw up the just a quick photo of the team at Achendo. And again, like I said, this team's been with them forever. So on the very, very right, Francoise Pechon. And then going right to left, we have Francoise, we have Nigel Kinsman, who again makes the red wines. Then we've got Bart Arajo, his wife Daphne, son Greg, and daughter Jamie. And then that's Steve Mathiasen in the sky blue shirt. I don't purport to know who the gentleman is on the extreme left. I don't want to disrespect him, but I'm sure he's important and he's very, very well dressed. So that's what we got. And I think this is it'll be fun because to just the juxtaposition and just in general of all these wines, I think that there's so many different ways we could have presented these, but I like the fact that we started with the Barton into the Achendo. I suspect the cost is going to be a much different wine. I think that's going to be a theme throughout the night. So obviously if anybody has any questions, let's keep them going and we'll engage. But for now, let's kick it over to Silas to talk about the 16 Coste d'Estournel.
All right, guys. Super excited about this wine. I'm a huge fan of Caz. They're lovely wines. I think Saint-Estèphe to me is my favorite region. And I'll go back to real fast, just the broader map of Bordeaux. I'll share this with you. Just give you kind of a context of what makes Saint-Estèphe different than the more southerly regions, is that when you get up here, you can see the Atlantic Ocean is right here, and the Gironde, the river, the estuary, when it hits the ocean, it obviously fans out and gets really wide. I mean, this is a huge distance, and the Saint-Estèphe is right here, the most northerly of the more respected regions. But it's really a thin landmass at this point. There's very little separating this from the actual Atlantic Ocean and the influence of the ocean, as well as the estuary itself. And those water bodies just really mitigate any major fluctuations in temperature much more than anything to the south. And what that does is just help them with these spikes in temperatures that have become more and more common. 16, which we're tasting, saw, as Simon said, quite a bit of dry weather in July and August, and it did see some significant heat spikes. And that can actually really directly impact their gravel soils that are very well drained, which is, traditionally been a great thing for the Chateaux of Bordeaux because it is a maritime climate. It is very close to the ocean, obviously. And so it can be, as it has been in 21, the vintage that's just being released on Premier, a very wet vintage. And well-drained soils actually, really do well in those vintages because grapevines don't like wet feet. You can kill a grapevine in a really, waterlogged soil and it can slow growth, etc. So, when the Dutch helped the Bordelais drain the gravel soils hundreds of years ago, it was a boom, obviously, for winemaking, but it was actually relatively easy. Once you lower the water table, these gravels, they don't have much. It's mostly big cobbles. They say gravels, but these are actually pretty big pebbles. These are pebbles to cobble size. And obviously water just flows through that because they're quite deep. So let's go to Caz itself. Caz is one of the, I think, most breathtaking estates. I haven't been there myself, but just from a outsider's perspective, there's no chateau quite like it. And let me just pull up a quick. There we go. So it was started in the early 1800s by the d'Estournel family. Oops. And the Seigneur d'Estournel was prominent businessman, inherited quite a bit of land in Saint Estèphe, but he famously got the idea for the estate when he was at Lafitte, actually, and was looking north across a small dip in the terrain that separates the two communes. And he had this, epiphany, according to the lore, that it would be a perfect aspect, very similar to Lafitte, actually, similar elevation, similar soils, and he owned some adjacent land to the parcel he had his eye on, and he ended up buying this parcel and starting to plant it. And it was relatively modest plantings at first, but he decided to construct this beautiful chateau. And he had a lot of business in India and was actually raising racehorses in India for a while. And he really admired the architecture of India as well as China. And so he kind of morphed them all together into this extravagant chateau with these pagoda structures. And he built it out of these like light-colored sandstone. It obviously is unique and is such a departure from the other chateaus. And you'll see that in the wine as well. So from the get-go, Cos d'Esternel has been predominantly Cabernet, but also a large percentage of Merlot. And it is planted now to predominantly Cabernet, but actually 38% Merlot. And the reason you can see this is the cooler climate to the north that Saint Estèphe has, but also, I'm going to pull up a geologic map. Cos d'Esternel has quite a bit more clay than some of the more freely drained soils to the south. And as you know from the right bank, if many of you are familiar with Pomerol or Saint-Emilion, is that Merlot tends to like heavy clay soils that are a little cooler, and that just combines really nicely with the early nature of Merlot. So Merlot, buds out earlier, it ripens earlier. That's why it's more popular in the heavy clay soils, is because those cool soils just prolong ripening, they prolong budding out. I mean, they're cold, they're wet, they're waterlogged, they hold on to water quite a bit. But what's nice about this, so way up top in the plateau is freely drained deep gravels and cobbles that the Gironde River has deposited over centuries. And this is where the Cabernet is predominantly planted. And then when you get into the shoulder is when you get into this like kind of clay mixed with gravel. And that's where Merlot has its sweet spot. And then you get into these marls that aren't planted as much, and that because it's so close to the marl is just a mixture of limestone and clay. And you get down towards the wet, soggy area that actually separates Saint-Estèphe from Pauillac, and Lafitte is just over here. So it's a really amazing estate because it's situated, the actual chateau is just situated right on top of the plateau, and it's surrounded by about 200 acres of vineyard. I mean, it's contiguous, which is, as Simon pointed out, actually pretty unique for Bordeaux, where parcels change hands over years. Marriages, inheritances tend to split things up, and people with deeper pockets over the centuries have just gobbled up the better parcels. Cos d'Esternel is not alone. They actually took a lot of the better parcels up on the plateau from their neighboring estates. When ownership was shared, it was, the nicer parcels was subsumed in Cos d'Esternel because it was designated as second growth in that 1855 classification. Obviously, you want to boost your top end. So let's drink the wine a little bit. As I mentioned, a high proportion of Merlot, and that high proportion does translate to the Grand Vin. There is a second wine, Bordeaux d'Esternel, and that is actually similar to Latour in that it comes from a specific parcel. It's not a second wine in the case of the quote unquote reject of the Grand Vin going into a second wine. It's a wine unto itself. It's a parcel. So this wine is distinctly hedonistic, and that as a descriptor, I think that comes back to Cos d'Esternel time and time again. I don't think it's unbalanced, and I don't think it's even as ripe as any approaching the ripeness of Napa, but it's big, it's tacitile, it's pretty ripe. I mean, 16 was a warm year. But it's got gorgeous chiseled fruit where it has, you know, that delineation I was talking about with the Chindo is even stepped up a notch here. And nice acid. I love the acid on this wine. But it has the ripeness of fruit, it has that mid palate, you know, fleshiness that you get from the Merlot. That's really nice. Cause d'Estremaux, you can tell this is a tannic wine. This is so much more, you know, closed and kind of pent up than compared to the Leoville Barton. And this wine it traditionally takes 20 plus years to start opening up. 20 is conservative or really, you know, liberal, I should say. But, you know, these wines stand the test of time, 40, 50 years. Neil Martin did an incredible retrospective all the way back to wines from the 20s, and they were still going strong. And this wine really stands the test of time. And I think that's because of the combination you get with the cooler climate of Saint Estèphe. You get physiological ripeness, that is, you know, the actual sunshine creating, you know, flavor development, you know, skins thickening, that sort of stuff, color development in the skins. But you get, you know, relatively lower alcohols and you get healthy acid. And that's what the, you know, the nice temperate weather kind of comes in. So you get this wine that is, you know, simultaneously concentrated, pretty ripe, but it's very balanced with the acidity and that pretty hefty tannins. And that's what I think really makes it go the distance. Is that combination and that the balance in excess almost. You know, it's quite a big wine, but it's inherently balanced, I think. What do you guys think? I mean, tasting a young cause is, I think, you gotta meet it where it is.
Yeah. To me, it's the wine that has just both on the nose and on the palate. I mean, obviously we haven't tasted, you know, in depth the other three yet, but this is the one that, you know, when I poured this out initially, much different on the nose now to how it is now, and the palate is much different than it was. So this wine is already, for me, opening up a ton. I don't know how this was for you, you know, when you sampled, you know, a couple of days ago, and if this is consistent for everybody else. But to me, this is already starting to, you know, take on like just a totally different dimension now. To your point, it actually to me almost had a, and I could be dead wrong here. It almost to me, and when you said hedonistic, it almost to me had a Southern Rhone type nose to it at first, you know, so which I wasn't expecting, obviously, and certainly not. It could just be, you know, could be me on June 16th at you know, 7 or 8 o'clock. I mean, that could be how Gerard is, and you know, not smelling particularly well, but it did have a little bit of just a super unique, interesting nose, but it's evolving. It's getting a lot different. But to your point, you know, it's a great. I think let's remove the Accendo from the equation. Let's just talk about very quickly, you know, or let me talk about real quick, Leoville and Cause, just, you know, both pedigreed properties, and from 2016 have made decidedly different wines. Yeah. You know, and I think neither is particularly better than the other. I just think that, and both are obviously quintessentially Bordeaux, but you know, the Cause just has a perhaps a little bit more, to me, an inviting quality. I mean, it's obviously a bruiser and it's going to go forever, but there's just a, you know, there's just a little bit more ripeness to it that makes it like, I don't need to reach for food right now if I'm having the Cause. You know, with the Leoville, it's like, all right, let me, where's that sausage at? You know, so but no, I just think it's, to your point, it's going to be a very long-lived wine. So
it's interesting. Go back, if you can, go back and just nose the Leoville compared to the Cause, and the Leoville now is very floral and almost so aromatic. It's Saint Julien against Saint Estèphe. I mean, I think that's the,
yeah.
So Silas mentioned very briefly about Lafite just being off the bottom end of that map there, and Cause d'Estremaux was owned for many years by the Prats family, Prats, and Bruno Prats was the owner, and his son Jean-Guillaume worked for him. Then when the Prats family sold to Rabier, Jean-Guillaume was kept on as general manager and eventually left Cause and rather circuitously going and making wines in China, of all places.
Oh, that's right.
Comes back and is now general manager at Lafite.
That's right.
And when you go to the new tasting room at Lafite, they've got this huge picture window that looks directly at Cos. So Jean, it's looking like, yeah, used to live there.
And Simon mentioned, so it's currently owned by a prominent Swiss hotelier named Ribière, and he has done an incredible job. Kind of, I don't think Cos ever went through the real doldrums that some estates went through, but it did it languished a little bit. It's hard to. I mean, going through Neil Martin's kind of retrospective, there was kind of a market dip in the late 90s and early 2000s, and that's when a lot of the ownership changing was happening. But Ribière has, fully invested in the estate. This castle, the pagoda topped castle, has never been lived in, and it's really always been a winery. And he totally redid it. They actually dug quite deep into the subsoil to make a full gravity winery, and it's really interesting because they actually installed a lot of mechanical pulley systems. So he was really reticent to kind of go with this like heavy mechanization and automation of modern Bordeaux, and so instead he really wanted everything to be gravity fed, and if not gravity fed, have very simple mechanisms of pulleys and counterweights that would last the next 200 years and never have to have a motherboard change. So I mean, definitely, I think 2010 and onwards, 09 really, you see a market just refinement, and I think that's because they did a lot of soil work. They now vinify, I think, 75 different parcels within their vineyard, which for 200 acres. That's still a lot of work to isolate, 75 parcels and vinify them separately, pick them separately, vinify them separately, sort them separately. I mean, that's just an incredible amount of work, and I think it shows in the finished wine.
And I think that shows to the modern approach, to winemaking, not just in Bordeaux, but in general, but certainly in Bordeaux. In the years past, they just send out the harvesters and they pick and they bring it all in and they crush it and they ferment it, and there's your wine. I mean, just what Simon is saying, I mean, not just picking separate little blocks in that you see on that map there, but sub blocks within those as the grapes ripen. It's so much more advanced thinking to winemaking in general, and what we get in the glass benefits from it dramatically.
And I think it does beg the question, I think in past years, both, states like Melrose and Cos d'Estournel were known for having a little less consistency, but when they, really succeeded, it was, legendary wines, just absolutely, like 61 Cos d'Estournel is, I think, a lot of people's, wines of their lives who've tasted it. And similar with great vintages of Melrose, but they were less consistent in years past. But at the same time, I think it begs the question of, are they missing a little bit of the complexity you get from having, slightly underripe grapes, slightly overripe grapes, having that combination that you get, and maybe you only hit the perfect, combination of those things in, once a decade. But when you do hit, I think you create, in my opinion, a better wine than even what you fashion in the similar year with a modern approach. And how do you feel about that, Simon?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I must say I hadn't really given that much consideration, because I see vintages that in Bordeaux that would have been disastrous 30, 40 years ago are now eminently drinkable wines and really enjoyable.
No, with optical sorting, I mean, I don't know if people are familiar with this, but you actually have, you have teams sorting grapes, taking out mog, which is material other than grapes. But at the final stage, you have grape by grape going across a conveyor belt that has technology that actually shoots little puffs of air up from the table. to every time a special optical device actually detects a grape that is slightly underripe or overripe. So it's actually able to eject it from the table and ultimately the finished wine. And it's an incredible technology, but I mean, to my point, it can save a bad vintage, but does it dull some vintages? I don't know.
Well, we're going to have another tasting, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, grab some bottles of 61. I'll see you tomorrow.
No, with this technology, you make me convinced we're going to put a man on the moon one day. I mean, but you're right. I mean, it's like, but really, it's wild how, to your point, I mean, it's just, incredibly precise. And, it's just, there's this almost, I won't say it eliminates the chance to make a inferior wine, but it's the winemaking is just at a completely different level. And to Simon's point, vintages that would have been disastrous, a couple decades ago are now considered, borderline solid vintages now. It may not be great vintages now, but I mean, it's just that you're making quality wines. But, kind of wrapping it back, Silas, to your point, there is something to be said for a little bit of just the charm of imperfection, that adds a little bit of character to wines. Obviously, we don't, we love, like, it just goes with everything in the world, right? I mean, we want modern technology, we want the advancements, we want everything to be better, but there's something to be said for just sort of that, that little bit of charm and the ability to, show a little bit of just imperfection without the makeup. So
I would almost say, I would go further. I would use stronger language than charm. I mean, I think of, Montrose is a perfect example where you have, 89, for example, where, yeah, it is bready. It is heavily infected with Brettanomyces, but gosh darn, I would be hard pressed. Anyone would be hard pressed to put that wine down. I mean, it is so aromatic. It's so intense. It transcendental. And you just don't get that with even the modern Montrose, after the sale in 2006, I think we'll go over it, but those sort of shifts from a traditional winemaking to a modern winemaking can be so different. And that's why I love the 05 Montrose, and I have stocked up. It's because that's like the last great vintage of old school Santa stuff.
Don't steal my thunder there, Silas.
Oh, sorry.
So I know we don't have our typical polling to throw up, and I know it'd be a little bit difficult just because we have so many of you joining us as part of a group, as part of couples or fours, or even in some cases sixes and eights. So it's going to be hard for any type of uniform decision. But by all means, throw your opinions or thoughts in the comments if there is any kind of consensus as to is there a runaway, or were all three of these 16s pretty close as to what you might have preferred. And we'll monitor, we'll talk about those in a little bit. And
so one final point on the cause.
Yeah.
The back label says 13.5%.
Oh, damn. That's wild. Wow.
Yeah.
Holy crap. Yeah.
Yeah. Moving on.
Simon, tell us about this Montrose.
Not yet. I'm saving myself. We've got something else coming up first.
Your 2018 Montrose. We want to learn all about it.
Oh, I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought we were doing Dominus first. I'm totally out of whack. Okay. So yeah, Montrose. I've got to get myself organized here. Hang on. There we go. So let's just go back for a second to your map of COS, and then go to the map of Santa Steph in general that I sent you. So while we're doing that, Montrose comes from a part of Santa Steph that for the longest time wasn't even growing grapes. It was basically famed for its hunting back then. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We'll stick with that. That's good. So, for its hunting and back in the late 1700s, it was owned by the Marquis de Ségur, who owned all of the land from Monrose up north. So I don't know if you can scroll down a little bit, Silas, or not on that map. There we go. All of the land from Monrose, the whole of the orange, yellow bit, all the way up to Calon-Ségur, the green patch there. So he owned all of that. And oh, just in passing, he also owned Lafitte and Latour. But I mean, you know, they, as if you look at a label of Calon-Ségur, there's a little heart on the label, and the saying is that yes, I owned Lafitte and Latour, but my heart was in Calon-Ségur. But the whole property was owned by Marquis de Ségur, and he then passed on the property to his son, who obviously had very little interest in the place at all, because shortly thereafter he sold it in 1778 to Etienne Dumoulin. And during the 1800s, Etienne Dumoulin owned, again, all of that property, and saw that at the spot where we now know as Monrose, that rises up from the river, all the way up from the river to a high point. Unique land there, gravel, hillside, terroir, and decided that he wanted to plant vines there, but when there were none up until then. And so he actually introduced and built the first winemaking facilities at Monrose. Silas, there's a photo of the chateau itself.
The older one.
Yeah. So if you look at that photo, you'll see on the left the original building with the grey slate roof and again the Bordeaux limestone, which is so typical of many Bordeaux properties. The limestone, generally speaking, came from Saint-Emilion, was shipped. And if you go to Saint-Emilion, there are vast galleries of underground caverns where all of the limestone was taken out and used to build the properties in Bordeaux. And that was the only property. Obviously, what's been added on since, including the solar panels on the right, were not there in the late 1700s. 1815, it was on, chateau was, the vineyards were planted, and it was on its way to now becoming recognized as one of the top vineyards or properties in Saint-Estèphe. The angle of the camera here is a little bit difficult, but you can see the vineyards stretching out behind the property, and that's basically a slightly sloping plateau, which if you get to the top of the plateau, go over the other side, you'll come down to Cos d'Estournel. But because vines were only planted in 1815, by 1855, the time of the great classification of the wines of the Medoc, Monrose was classified as second growth after only 40 years of making wines. In 1861, Monrose was sold to Mathieu Dolphus, and he rebuilt much of the property, adding on rooms for the farm workers, for the vineyard workers, the estate workers, and erecting new buildings as well. And then the next major chapter in Monrose was in 1896, when the property was sold to the Charmelot family. I just back up a little. The Dumoulin family had by then sold Calon-Ségur, and they just kept Monrose. But then so it moved on to the ownership of the Charmelot family, who had quite an interesting Bordeaux connection, because the original Charmelot who bought the property was actually born at Chateau Figeac in Saint-Emilion. So it stays in the family a little bit. And then by marriage, and this brings us full circle almost, by marriage, Monsieur Charmelot also inherited Chateau Cos d'Estournel, which he then sold in 1917 to the Ginestez family, who then owned it for many years. So back to Monrose. 3 generations of Charmelot owned Monrose and really built the property and the quality of the wine to an amazing extent. and became one of the first properties in Bordeaux to actually bottle their own wines at the chateau. In the past, almost everybody had made their wines, put them into barrel, and then sent the wine in barrel down to the merchants on the waterfront and the riverfront in Bordeaux, who then bottled the wines. Now, of course, it's de rigueur to chateau bottle. You can't do anything else. But Monrose was one of the first to actually bottle their wines at the chateau. In 1960, Charmolue, or Jean-Louis Charmolue, took control of the property. And so from 60 to 2006, the Charmolue family still owned it, at which time in 2006, the brothers Bourgne, I can never pronounce that word, it's spelled totally different from the way it's pronounced, Bourgne. And they purchased the property, making most of their money in construction and in telecommunications. But they had loved the wine and thought, if ever an opportunity comes up for us to buy it, we want to do it. And that's what they did in May of 2006. They have plowed an enormous amount of money and forethought and consideration into rebuilding and expand, well, not expanding, but trying to make Monrose even better. There's the new first-year barrel cellar, hardly a cellar. They engaged two top Bordeaux architects to not just design and build this, but much of the rest of the property. But in doing so, they also didn't just look at spending money on the building. They hired, from his retirement, John Delmas, who was the general manager and the winemaker at Chateau Aubryon for many, many years. When he retired and his son took over, the owners of Monrose hired him as their first consultant. And then a few years later, they went out into the market again and hired Hervé Berland. And Hervé was the general manager at Chateau Mouton Rothschild for something like 40 years. And he now is the general manager at Monrose and has control over the winemaking there. That renovation at Monrose, by the way, just in case you're wondering, cost about $57 million. Stamp money for some people. But in doing all of this, I mean, one of their mandates was that they wanted to be as green as possible, and they now obtain as much of their energy through use of solar. They've been established, as you saw in the previous photo, there was some solar panels on the roof. Well, there's 1,700 solar panels at Monrose now, and they use wind, water, and a very sophisticated geothermal energy system for heating and cooling the buildings. Very thick walls, thick glass in all the buildings, so that they very little loss of heat or indeed loss of cool air. So the vineyard map, as we see there, this is looking from, as you can see, from north to south. The land slopes from the right across the plateau down quite steeply to the river itself. And in the center of that is that little green patch, and the chateau and the buildings, the winery buildings are all in that little green patch there. You stand on the edge of that and you can see the river, obviously, because you're at the top of the crest. But then those vineyards slope down, and you can see that the majority of those vineyards in front of the chateau are all Cabernet Sauvignon. Merlot is behind on a slightly flatter, heavier clay soil. As Silas alluded to at Cos d'Estournel, the river deposits back in the ages left a lot of gravel and heavy stones on that part of the banks of the river, and Monrose has benefited considerably from that. The vineyard is planted 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, 32% Merlot, 6% Cabernet Franc, and 2% Petit Verdot. Where's the Petit Verdot gone? It's there somewhere, hiding. Oh, there it is. No, on the edge of the slope, coming down to the river. There's Petit Verdot. old vines, some going back to 1932, but they replant on obviously an annual basis, but in doing so, they are replanting using graftings from their own stock. So they're not going out and buying new vines and replanting them. The soil itself, the gravel can get as deep as 6 feet in some parts of that slope there. Various terraces, and again, the vineyard plots, as Silas was mentioning, they're harvesting something like 100 separate parcels within that plot, and again, contiguous. So unlike Lowell Barton, you've got all of the vineyards next to each other. In 2010, they purchased an additional 54 acres from neighboring Chateau Fay-Lansegueur and added that. So now there's a total of, I think, 234, 35 acres that are under vine at Monrose. It's always, I think, one of the most striking wines from Santa Steph. I would not necessarily argue with Silas that Cos is perhaps the most impressive, but get Monrose in a good vintage and it's absolutely stunning. We've got the 18 here, 72% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Merlot, 6% Cabernet Franc, and 2% Petit Verdot, aged 60% in new oak.
I don't know about you guys, but I won't go so far as to call the wine ready to go. But of all the wines that I thought might wave the Dikembe Mutombo finger and say, no, 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 I'm not ready to drink tonight, I was, I thought the Montrose might have been the one that, could have been a little bit of a, certainly assertive. And I think that there's an inviting quality to it. Again, not by any means ready to go, and this wine is going to last forever. But it's giving something tonight. Yeah. I think it's really. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of fruit showing here. Big, rich, muscular style of wine. A lot of firm tannins, almost dry, dusty tannins in the back, but really fine, well-balanced tannins, which is a hallmark of Monrose. This richness to it. 100 out of 100 from Jeb Dunnock, so they did something right.
Yeah. And I think there were, a lot of really high marks for it. And to that, exactly it. Like, just there is a level of the purity of the fruit, I think, and I think Jeb might have mentioned it, but some other critics, I think that's, to me, the hallmark of just, clearly there's so much, this wine's going to develop and get so much better, but there's a purity of fruit that's unmistakable in it,
Yeah. The interesting, because the harvest itself, the year itself of the harvest, the first 6 months were terrible. It rained so much in the first 6 months in Bordeaux that they had equal amount of rain in the first 6 months that on average Bordeaux gets in a year. But again, draining soils, and the vines don't like to get their feet wet, and they don't up there in the better parts of Bordeaux. But then August through October were very hot, concentrating the sugars, the color on the skins, but with cool nights because of the influence, particularly of the river. It allowed the grapes to mature in a way that still retained the acidity. The other thing about the river, of course, which is important, is that these areas around the river, whilst you read about Bordeaux having heavy frosts, there they rarely have frost because the river influence protects the vineyards from frost. So this is compare it to previous vintages, which is difficult but I think there were 2 vintages that Parker gave 100 points to. I think it was the 09 and the 90. But I'm pretty convinced that if we had the 90 next to this today, this would hold up remarkably well, and would just tell you, no, leave me alone for another 30 years. And
Silas, jump in. What do you think?
I agree. It is, oh,
That's a
it's
wine.
pretty tannic, but it has this ripeness of fruit, and I don't think it's lost its character necessarily with Montrose. It definitely is. Does not showing any Brettanomyces, which I think for most people is a good thing. Yeah, I think they've done a great job. I think they've done a great job with the vineyard. I would love to see this, as Simon was saying, in 30 years. I think it's going to be a gorgeous wine.
Yeah. Yeah. Any questions from anyone?
I think personally, I kind of prefer this to the cause.
I'll thank you tomorrow. Don't forget they're two different vintages, Silas. So I mean, it's, you know, take that into consideration. Yeah.
I know.
Silas, talk to us about the 18 Dominus, which I think is like wildly aromatic wine. I have actually yet to taste it, and I'm sure some people have, and I'm going to get there here in a second. But this is a crazy aromatic.
Yeah, let's jump into Christian Moix's crown jewel. So, as many of you are probably familiar with Christian Moix, of the famed Bordeaux family, owners of such estates as Petrus and Tratenois. What else? They own quite a bit.
Belamanage.
Yeah, Hosanna. Yeah.
Oh, jeez, yeah. Half of the top estates of the right bank these days.
Got a little
But no,
time
in all
for Dominus,
seriousness, really probably the finest crafters of Merlot-based wines in the world. You know, just period. Petrus speaks for itself. You know, the prices have gotten out of hand, but the wines are phenomenal. When Christian Moix was a much younger man, he was born in 1945. He studied in California actually for his undergrad, and he visited Napa and just fell in love with the landscape, you know, with the land itself. And I think this gets to, you know, we've spoken a lot about this as a team. When you go to a specific wine region, that's when you really understand it. That's when you really understand its soul. I mean, you feel the climate, you understand the vineyards, you understand the landscape. And I think it really spoke to Christian when he was a young man, you know, who had grown up in, you know, the famed vineyards of Bordeaux. He returned a couple of years later and used his not insignificant familial wealth to buy the famed Napa Nook vineyard. And this was, you know, a really prized estate. I'll show you guys a map of in northern Yountville. And this is, you know, the tenderloin of Napa Valley. You know, this is right on the border with Oakville. They now have another vineyard called Ulysses just to the north. But, you know, Napa Nook has an incredible history, part of one of the first plantings of vineyards in Napa. That is the Hopper Ranch that was bought from Yount, who had the original land grant, the Rancho Camus land grant. So this is some OG stuff. Let me grab a map real fast. Wow, got a lot of images here. There we go. Okay.
A quick story while Silas is finding that. When my very first trip to Bordeaux, and I visited Pomerol, and a young Christian Moix gave me a drive around showing me the vineyards. I had no idea that he was going to become the star that he has become.
This was before he was famous by putting images of himself on the label, huh?
That's absolutely right, yeah. Before he bought and then sold his Francis Bacon triptych.
Okay.
really pleasant individual. I mean, so outgoing and so enthusiastic about his wines. If you ever have an opportunity to meet him, if he comes to any of your locations and does a tasting, go, because he's well worth listening to.
Okay. Here we go. All right. Sorry, folks. Here we go. All right, here's Yountville. So this is, pretty far down the Napa Valley, pretty close to San Pablo Bay. So it has quite a bit of the fog influence. You see a lot of those fluctuations from daytime to nighttime temperatures. So that's where you get the really nice ripening and phenolic development during the day, but quite a bit of acid retention during the night because of those temperature drops. I'm talking about 40 to 50 degrees of change between daytime highs and nighttime lows. I mean, you go from sweating in a t-shirt to putting on a puffy vest at night. So Dominus is located right here. This is the Napa Nook estate with the Paradise Hills right above it. But this is actually one of the older vineyards in the area. And it's located, you see, it's right on the edge of the mountains. And this is where, years of activity, of rainfall, of landslides have pushed so much material into the valley. And it's relatively flat in the valley because the Napa River has changed course so quickly over the millennia, flood events, that sort of thing. You have it, it's all the way over here now, but once upon a time you had it swinging over here and leveling everything out. So you have this complex array of soils, a colluvium, which means that it dropped down from the mountains, landslides as such, and alluvium, which is reworked by water, really complex array. But because it's at the valley bottom, they have a really unique opportunity to dry farm, which most sites in Napa Valley are irrigated, which, as you know, as a Frenchman, Christian Moix was probably uncomfortable with, given that it's illegal in the country. But he wasn't also comfortable from a theoretical standpoint of having a, hydroponics almost, where you're feeding the grape exactly the water and nutrients you need to create a product that you're looking for. He's much more interested, I think, in the Bordelais approach of seeing what a place well managed can produce just by itself. So they have a little bit wider spacing than a lot of their neighbors. They have their vines on different rootstocks than a lot of their neighbors that are designed to delve deeper into the alluvial and colluvial soils and really reach that shallow water table that the valley floor has. And the result is a Cabernet-based wine that has all 5 noble varieties of Bordeaux planted in lesser amounts, of course. But it is now obviously an icon of Napa Valley for a reason. Since those late 80s, early vintages, we've tasted those in office. I think we had the 89 not too long ago. It was a nice wine. Yeah, I don't think he hadn't hit his stride yet. I think his stride, they really, it takes a couple seasons to really understand a place. Christian Moix's favorite line is, I love to visit and really understand a vineyard in the winter, because that's when where you see water pooling, that's where you see fog pooling, you see everything without the canopy, and that's when you see the vines bare and really understand the landscape a little bit better. And I think that's really important. That's a lot more insightful than a lot of these celebrity and rich mogul pet projects that you see elsewhere. He really, while he has wealth behind him, he's dedicated to really like understanding a place and creating a wine that is true to that place. And let's take a look. The 18 vintage well, it was a pretty, classic Napa vintage. It didn't actually see as many heat spikes as recent drought years, and they had a replenishment of water during the rainy season, which they really need. Especially as a dry farm vineyard, those, prolonged drought years, which have in the past 2 decades seem to stretch for about 3 consecutive vintages. They really have to do a lot of work in the vineyard to, shield grapes, drop a lot of grapes, really limit their yields, because those vines are not irrigated, obviously. They're drawing on reserves that are dwindling over the seasons. So a year like 18, you see kind of a return to classicism. They can have higher yields, but they also have just more active, more healthy vineyards. And so you see a very nice acid retention, great phenolic development, really nice color. Traditionally, Moex has kept his alcohol around 14.1. In recent years, he has bumped it to 14.5. That's, of course, what it's listed at. But I think it's still one of the more classic, balanced, age-worthy, but also approachable wines made in all of Napa Valley. I mean, I think there's a reason it's a benchmark. We were just talking to our coworker who had the 92, and it was, what did he say? 10 years time, it will still be going. These are wines that have, already stood the test of time, and year after year are just absolute benchmarks for vintage, for Yountville, for Napa as a whole. So let's take a look. Just gorgeous. I mean, really, like, peppery, so aromatic, cut violets, I would say, white flowers, but also pretty ripe. I mean, it has the Napa fruit, it has a New World fruit, but it's so balanced with, some sandalwood, some baking spices. There's oak, but it's already pretty integrated. It's incredible. So smooth, beautiful tannins, but enough acid to keep your mouth watering. You feel it in the back, on the side, your jowls a little bit, where it's like, it's just water. And, that's why it's a beautiful wine on its own, because it's inherently balanced, but it's also a food wine. I would love to have this at a dinner. What do you guys think?
I'm coming to your place. It's been fascinating for me, and you mentioned about the earlier vintages have done this, but it's been fascinating for me to see the progress and the how it's literally grown up from a young toddler that couldn't even walk to something that is elegant and stunning. It needed that time in the vineyard. It needed him to understand, and his winemaking team to understand what they were working with and how it was being produced. And this is it's.
I think it's terrific. I think it's it's interesting because it's never going to be the wine that I would hand to somebody and say, this is, quintessential isn't the right word, but the way I'm trying to describe it, it's not that I would describe it as like, hey, this is how the majority of Napa wines are, because obviously they're not. This is a wine that is a distinct outlier in Napa, not trying to pick too early, because to Saus's point, the wine's not underripe. The wine obviously is not it's not a Coruscant-esque 13.5 ABV, and it's not anything like that. The wine has the ripeness, but there's just something to be said for everything that goes into the philosophy from start to finish, from the very beginning of the season to the very end. I mean, there's just a heavy Bordeaux influence. And again, not that the wine tastes, it doesn't, again, not call it a dead ringer for Bordeaux by any stretch, but this is a decidedly atypical Napa wine that I can understand would be, a little bit polarizing to, not polarizing, but might not be everybody's cup of tea. I think it's fantastic. I also think it's going to be crazy different from the wine that I'll talk about in a little bit, in a few minutes here with the Schrader. But it's just, it's a great example of, to Simon's point, I mean, somebody who clearly has established himself and it's just firing on all cylinders now, and is committed to do things his own way. I mean, this is, and there's, again, not that there's right or wrong, but this is gonna always be the dominant style, and it's not going to change from vintage to vintage. So if you're on board, great. If you're not, there's so many great other Napa Valley wines that might be more to your palate, and that's Christian Wicks is not going to change the style. Todd Macero is not going to change the style of wine that he makes.
Yeah. No, and one of the better bottles of 2011 Napa, which is considered a disaster by Napa standards. One of the best bottles I've had was 2011 Dominus.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a gorgeous wine. It was gorgeous wine. And I think that was because they just understood a more maritime climate. Coming from Bordeaux, they're like, oh, a rainy year, we know exactly what to do. Maybe shorten our cold soaks, drop more fruit. They knew how to manage a vineyard when the season was going as it was, and they produced a wine that I think was true to place and true to vintage, but also gorgeous. And I think that just shows their expertise and just speaks to exactly what they're trying to do. They're not trying to produce a wine that's not true to place. They're not trying to produce a Bordeaux. It's not Petrus, but it's Dominus at its essence. And what's fascinating is they're not trying to expand. Ulysses is their new vineyard in Oakville, just to the north, actually part of the same original Hopper Ranch. But it's in Oakville, and it's a totally different terroir, totally different soil type, and they're treating it differently. It's a totally different brand. They don't subsume their neighbors' properties and kind of build out, because they're treating this parcel as a unit, and just kind of trying to interpret what that place has to say.
And by contrast, Gerard.
Yeah, exactly. So so with that said, let's get into, but what's fascinating is that the Schrader that we're about to talk about, and Stylus, if we can kind of work our way from just a macro level map of Napa into into a more Oakville map, into a more site specific To Kalon map progression, that would be great. The cool thing, just fascinating, is that the Dominus, and in the grand scheme of things, the Dominus and this Schrader from To Kalon Vineyard, not particularly that far away from one another vineyard wise, and the wines could not be more divergent, and it's just speaks to so much. So here, just as a macro look at where we're at in Napa, working our way south to north, and then to Silas's point, I mean, whereas Dominus is right at that Yountville Oakville kind of border there. The To Kalon Vineyard is going to be more or less the heart of Oakville on the west side. So if exactly, Silas is right there. So we'll get it on a map, as we go into that Oakville AVA map. Part of the valley still gets the fog coming off the bay, but certainly gets warm enough during the day, but very, very cool during the night to retain just enough acidity to make the wine super interesting. And when Silas brings up that Oakville map, we'll get a chance to see exactly where we're at. No worries if you don't have it right away. But as far as the Schrader goes, 18 CCS from, again, the Beckstoffer To Kalon Vineyard in Oakville, one of the truly iconic first growth caliber Napa Valley vineyards. The CCS that we poured out tonight, considered to be one of the longest lived of all the Schrader wines, is 100% Cabernet, 100% Clone 4 Cabernet from the C1 block of the Beckstoffer To Kalon Vineyard. So, as I mentioned, earlier in the hour, I mean, you could not get a more site-specific wine. And here, actually, this is perfectly fine. We can kind of dive a little bit more into the micro here. So this is the To Kalon Vineyard, and the border, the eastern border, is Highway 29 there, and the To Kalon Vineyard, quite a large vineyard. And if Silas could maybe just zoom in a little bit, that kind of beige or brownish part is the Beckstoffer portion It's quite a large vineyard. Yeah. So as you can see, a lot of that vineyard is owned by Mondavi and Opus One, small portion. I suspect a lot of guys and girls are familiar with McDonald. Just ultra culty, like just doing serious stuff with their little sliver of old vine To Kalon fruit. Dieter, super underrated, tough to get, but does control a small portion of the of To Kalon vineyard. But as you can see, the majority of it is controlled by Mondavi. Beckstoffer, Andy Beckstoffer feels like he has the true tenderloin of it. He's got about 85 to 90 acres of To Kalon, which is a couple hundred acres, as you can see, much larger. And those this Schrader wine comes from blocks that are kind of like right where you see the word Beckstoffer. I mean, this is the tenderloin. He feels he's got the tenderloin of the vineyard, and then this Schrader comes from that C1 block. If Silas could bring up the block map, there we go. So C1. So there you go. So that's just kind of zooming it in even further. So C1, Clone 4 Cabernet. This is I mean, not old vine, but generally speaking, I mean, he's Andy's replanting some of the To Kalon vineyard in bits and pieces, but this Schrader portion from the C1 block has always been a super high level performer. And we'll get into in a second, what that clone means and why it's important, because again, whereas we talked about the Accendo blending from all around the valley, right there, I mean, C1 block, boom, this is where this wine comes from. And all the other Schrader bottles that you see are coming from different blocks with different clones and different expressions of Cabernet. And that's kind of the Schrader MO. So, so the history of Schrader real quick, presently the most awarded winery in the history of American wine. 27 different 100-point scores from various critics. The first winery to ever receive 100 points in 4 consecutive vintages. Parker gave incidentally, the CCS that we're having tonight. 05, 06, 07, 08, CCS, all hundreds. First time this ever happened in the history of Wine Advocate. Fred Schrader caught the serious wine bug after attending a Napa Valley wine auction in 1988. And he co-founded Colgan Schrader Cellars in 92 with his wife, Anne. But after their split in 97, Anne kept what we obviously now know today as Colgan Cellars, and Fred had to face the prospects of starting out on again on his own. And the turning point for him came, even though he did actually, there was Schrader Cellars, he established Schrader Cellars in 98. There were a couple of vintages pre-2000, but the turning point came after he had a bit of an epiphany wine, which was a late 90s Barons and Hitchcock Cabernet that blew him away. And it was one of those wines that he said, like, hey, where does this wine come from? This wine is super distinctive. What part of Napa does this come from? Come to find out that it comes from the To Kalon vineyard. They're in Oakville, and not just the To Kalon vineyard, but the Beckstoffer portion of it that's controlled again by Andy Beckstoffer. And he said, hey, he went immediately down to Andy Beckstoffer and said, hey, can I get some fruit? This is my plan for it. He hired Thomas Rivers Brown, who has gone on to be his winemaker, not quite since day one, because like I said, there were a couple of years of early Schrader, but by and large, Thomas Rivers Brown is inextricably linked to Fred Schrader, and together the two of them are almost inextricably linked to Andy Beckstoffer, because so much of the Schrader program is built off of the Beckstoffer To Kalon vineyard, despite making some wines from other sites. So quickly about To Kalon, again, one of the Napa Valley's oldest sites, planted in 1868 by Hamilton Crabbe. It's since been divided and now has, a multitude, not a multitude, but it has multiple owners, as Silas showed on the map before, where there's Mondavi in the Opus One portion, Dieter, McDonald, a small portion of it also controlled by UC Davis for experimental purposes and just kind of educational purposes. And Andy Beckstoffer, again, owns his portion there, and he's considered arguably Napa Valley's most influential grape grower, the owner of 6 heritage old school Napa Valley vineyards, Dr. Crane, Las Piedras, George III in Rutherford, the Bourne Vineyard, Missouri Hopper. But To Kalon is his crown jewel for sure. He purchased roughly 80-ish acres of To Kalon in 93. And this was previously owned by BV. So any of the old school BV private reserves had a good portion of the To Kalon fruit. And Andy's very well known for being super particular about, who he sells wines to and how his wines are branded. It's staggering to think he makes no qualms about it. The prices for his grapes, he's so confident that his grapes, and especially To Kalon, are of the first growth, ultra premium caliber. $26,000 for a ton of grapes, compared to the Napa Valley average is about 7 or 8 grand. So it's wild to think. I mean, To Kalon, Beckstoffer To Kalon, to throw that name on the label, as 3x the price of the majority of Cabernet you'll find elsewhere in the valley. But also what makes Schrader so unique is we talk about the clones, and that's where Schrader really makes their wines, I would say, I don't want to say complicated, but makes their wines super unique, but can also be challenging to kind of wrap your head around, because they have so many different labels. The majority of their wines, even though they make some wines from outside of To Kalon, the majority of their wines come from To Kalon, labeled differently, and just are different expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon clones. So what is a clone? A clone is a viticultural term for where a population of vines is derived from propagation from a single mother vine. So in essence, you're getting cuttings or buds of vines that are genetically identical. So everything is the same. So your C1, everything planted here is clone 4 Cabernet. So the Beckstoffer CCS Cabernet we're having tonight, again, from that C1 block, and clone 4 Cabernet. The Schrader RBS is clone 337 Cabernet from a different portion of this vineyard. It's probably even on there. But again, you're talking about from, you can more or less, it's walking distance from, one little vineyard block to another, and just different expressions. So painting with a super broad brush, 337, that clone 337, a lot more generous and inviting Cabernet, a little bit more plush, a little bit more easy, not easy drinking by any stretch, but early drinking. How about that? Whereas the clone 4 Cabernet, super small berries, tannins are there, so the wine is super long lived. Also has quite a bit of herbaceous notes, and is always going to be considered one of the longest lived Cabernets for Schrader. And the last little piece of the puzzle, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, is Thomas Rivers Brown. I mean, it's just easily one of Napa Valley's most accomplished winemakers, who now consults for over 50 clients, which is crazy to wrap your head around. But again, like I said before, always going to be inextricably linked to Schrader. He makes wines for other great properties like Maibach and Riverrain and Outpost. And you see, he's a fantastic winemaker and consulting winemaker. But he, obviously made his money and his reputation is always going to be, tied to Fred Schrader and fruit from Andy Beckstoffer's To Kalon vineyard. The common theme that always runs through the Schrader wines, and Wine Spectator kind of nailed it when they said, complexity, graceful balance, and a generosity of fruit. And I think that last little part is, the wines are complex, and they are very, very fruit driven. But they are also, it's the way that they manage to balance these wines is always remarkable. And if we can get into it now, when I smelled this wine before, I was like, it's crazy how you hear descriptors, and sometimes you're like, you have to really search to find it. For me, I picked up the wine and I wasn't even looking for it. And I was like, whoa, chocolate covered cherries. Like, that's like, when I smell a box of chocolate covered cherries, like, that's where I'm at. And then I went back to it a second time, and it almost smelled like Dr. Pepper-ish. And that's crazy. But like, when I think about it, Dr. Pepper almost has so much of that clove profile. So it's almost like that clove and cinnamony profile. And I just think that it's a super, super unique nose. And it's decidedly different from the Dominus, which is decidedly different from the Montrose. And damn it, it's decidedly different than everything else we had tonight. But let's try it as we wrap up the night. And I may be the last one to try it, because I suspect and it's just, this is kind of why we figured, this was a bruising wine. There's a lot of fruit, but there's a smokiness, there's a lot going on here. To me, I'm super impressed by the trio of 18s. I think all the wines have been super interesting in their own way, but to me, the 18s have all shown decidedly different, and I wouldn't argue with anybody who prefers one over the other. And if somebody were to rank one of them in third place, so to speak, I think you'd almost have to be splitting hairs. So what do you think, Silas? Too modern for you, or does it toe the line well. And be honest, I mean, I think there's no doubt this is Thomas Rivers Brown, and Schrader said, like, they make no apologies for it. This is Napa Valley. This is modern Napa Valley. And
from a personal perspective, I wanted to hate this wine, and I do not. It's too sexy. The bottom line, the fruit is, it's really pure. It's silky. It's concentrated. It's alcoholic, but it carries it well. You know, I think this is a good way to end the tasting. I wouldn't start with this wine. It's a big wine and it's young. I would love to see how it ages. I would love to taste a Magnum of Old Sparky, you know, from 10 years ago.
Ooh. You're a brave man. So, I found I didn't go in there prejudiced, but you know, everybody knows who's here tonight that my love is Bordeaux. I was expecting something. This actually is better than I was expecting, because I was expecting something that was going to knock my socks off and you know, win all blind tastings, and that's why it got the score it does. There's much. Yes, it's a big, complex, heavy wine, but there's a lot going on there.
Yeah,
there's a lot going on there, and it's not a wine that I would particularly enjoy drinking right now. I would be fascinated. I've never had Old Schrader. I'd love to have.
Yeah. I think that just with the way, at least to me, with the way that over the course of, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I know we're pushing 2 hours, and to that point, you know, thank you all for really honestly taking part and letting us talk about these great wines for, you know, as long as we have, and we'll wrap it up here in a few minutes. But I think this was another one that is just, every time I go back to it, is totally different, and I think this is going to be a completely different wine. You know, if anybody has any sample, you know, and lets it hang out for an hour or two, you know, certainly. And if not, you know, revisits, has a couple bottles that they'll try down the line. But to Silas's point, there's so many great mid 2000s. I wouldn't necessarily go back to the early 2000s, but mid to, you know, 05, 06, 07. There's a reason that those were, you know, those early Schraders were 100 pointers, and they have been, I don't want to say validated, that's probably not the right word, but they're drinking beautifully and just have evolved and just kind of melted away some of, like, it's not all about power, because right now this wine is all about muscle and power. But I think there's just so much interesting nuance behind it, and it speaks to, you know, how much pedigree there is at To Kalon. I know Jose was asking, is this in the Paul Hobbs sections of the To Kalon come from a little bit more, actually a little bit more north. I'll send you something, Jose, tomorrow. I got a cool map on where everybody tore, and Paul Hobbs and different producers source from To Kalon. But no, I mean, to me, this is, I loved all the wines tonight in their own way. I just, to me, the Schrader is a showstopper, but it's one of those wines, I get it, much like the Dominus, even, that if it's a little polarizing, I get it. Like, if it's not your style, that's totally fine. You know, here, you know, Dominus and Schrader, and again, separated by not all that much in Yountville and Oakville, the wines couldn't be more different. Yeah. So if you have a preference, you know, that's why we drink wine, and, you know, we should have our own preferences. I'll give it to the Schrader.
Tonight we're walking through a gallery. I mean, we're literally looking at 6 different artists, and some work with the same medium, some don't, but they all have different styles.
Yeah. Well, great lineup. It's education for me, that's for sure.
A lot of good wines here.
Yeah, this is.
But you know, I'm every day drinking wine is an education, or tasting wine is an education for me.
Sure. So with that, we'll. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I know, just one of the fun things about being in this business.
Absolutely.
It's every day you taste the wine, and every day, the next day, the wine is different.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Well, is it a root day or not?
Yeah, that's right. It's true. It is different every day. So
I'll check my cow horn and tell you.
Yes,
it's a full moon tonight. Be prepared.
Well, with that, we will wrap it up. We will, from the three of us, I will speak for the three of us, and I know thank you all for being a part of this. This was a wildly successful event. It would not have gone off with the support from everybody. Like I said, I know we had so many people that were kind of joining as couples or fours or eights, and a great turnout, visually here tonight. But
thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, I mean, even more so that those who couldn't join. This was exciting, to be able to pull it together on a Zoom. But with that, very quick segue to, I'm sure everybody got the invitations to join us next weekend for it's to that point, even more exciting to know that we have some in-person stuff lined up and different wines for sure. We'll taste some Grand Cru Chablis and some, Grand Cru and Premier Cru, Red Burgundy, much different wines from tonight, but that is, please do, if you haven't had that invitation or got a chance to look at that invitation, please keep an eye out for that. We'll send a reminder, and joining us next week and next Saturday for Pinot Noir tasting.
So just to clarify, that is not a Zoom tasting. That is here.
There you go. Exactly. Right. So
that is here at the Chicago
real people.
Saturday afternoon, real people.
That is Simon Lambert pouring your wine. That's Gerard Metchka pouring your wine. That's Silas Morgan pouring your wine. So please do, if at all possible, please join us. I know we actually have had a wonderful response already, and even in the first 24 hours for people RSVPing. But for anybody who hasn't RSVP'd and might have some free time available, please join us next Saturday. We'll all be there and pouring some more great wines. So, and
you won't just get to see us on the screen; you'll get to meet us in person.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. So. Yeah. If you guys don't come for the Clos de Bez, I'll drink the rest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, please, nobody comes. Silas will drink all of the Grand Cru Clos de Bez. Exactly.
We'd love to see you though, and hope to see you again.
Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
With that, we'll sign off. Cheers all.